Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gene Jones. I'm going to hold my opening comments till tomorrow's opening session. I'm going to go ahead and get us started right away. I think we're going to enjoy this session because Mr. Michael Goldstein put this together for us and has got a wealth of very educated speakers in the various subject matter that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm not going to waste any more time. We are recording this as well as we do have some folks online, so welcome virtual attendees. And with that, Mr. Goldstein, it is yours, sir.
I'm vertically challenged. Gene, thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to 2025 Florida Remediation Conference. I am Michael Goldstein. I'm with the Goldstein Environmental Law Firm. I'm pleased and honored to be here. Gene, thank you for having me for all of these years. It's wonderful to be with so many distinguished colleagues and friends. I am really excited about this year's kickoff panel, this pre-conference workshop, because of who my co-panelists are. This is a group of heavy hitters. We have more heavy hitters in the audience, but I'm thrilled by the perspective that my colleagues will be presenting regarding this very exciting issue. Many issues actually related to the legislation that passed earlier this year, House Bill 733, Brownfields legislation. We'll get into that in a second. But briefly, I want to introduce, starting at my immediate right, Kerri Barsh, who is a shareholder with GreenbergTraurig, one of the preeminent environmental lawyers in the state of Florida. Say hello, Kerri.
Well, hi, everyone.
Next to Kerri, we have Howard Nelson, another leading environmental attorney in the state of Florida with a tremendous amount of experience. Howard is a partner with a law firm of Bilzin Sumberg. And then we have Jen Farrell, who is the program administrator for the Waste Cleanup Program, very senior regulatory official with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. These are important people to hear from with respect to House Bill 733 as we all try to figure out what this means, how it will benefit our constituents and our clients and our partners and colleagues, and on and on and on. There are no definitive answers at this point. This is all very new. We're all trying to figure it out. And I know that the department and some of the local pollution control programs are deeply invested in understanding the opportunities and the challenges of the new rule, where there may be some opportunities to tweak the rule or the statute going forward and its various provisions. And we want to encourage dialogue in this session. Now, I'm going to go through a few slides for context, and then we're going to turn it over to each of our panelists to offer some perspective from what they're seeing from their clients and constituents, and then we're looking forward to hearing from everyone in the audience, from our fellow colleagues. The first thing I want to say is this. When I was leaving for the plane this morning, my wife asked me if I was going to bring out the cows. Now, a little background on what that means. For the past 5 or 6 years, I've been presenting on Brownfields legislation nationally at the Florida Brownfields Association Conference, and looking with envy at some of the incentives and regulatory programs that other states have. Even though we have a wonderful program here in the state of Florida, I will match our program against any other program in the United States, but still it's always nice to see what's on the other side of the fence. And in doing so, it became clear to me and to others that there were some enhancements that Florida could stand to adopt. And the notion of doing things differently in Florida after having a statute that dates back to 1997 suggested to some that we were looking to slay sacred cows. And I've had a slide for years that puts Tom Hanks in a league of their own in juxtaposition to all of this legislative stuff. And the analogy I drew was, just as there's no crying in baseball, there are no sacred cows in brownfields. And each presentation had a lot of cow icons and imagery. And so my wife said, are you going to have cows having a little party, given your legislative victory, and I said, well, the jury is out as to whether they're celebrating in a good way or they're bemoaning what has come to pass. I think that we can all agree that in most respects, this legislation, I titled the program as a marvelous evolution of the Florida Brownfields program, that the legislation moves the program forward in many, many ways. Important ways. This is a very mature program, the Florida Brownfields program. We have annual reports to the legislature going back to 1997 through 2025, and the reason I have this slide is just to demonstrate that FDEP has had a lot to say about brownfields over an extended period of time. That's 28 years since 1997. The legislature likes the Florida Brownfields program very much. We have proven results. There are lots of good metrics to talk about. As of September 2nd, 2025, DEP reports 613 brownfield areas covering 292,000 acres, 531 BISRAs covering almost 7,000 acres, and then we have a tremendous amount of economic activity in the state of Florida on abandoned and underutilized contaminated sites that, but for the Brownfields program, wouldn't exist. Long story short, we have a lot of political goodwill in the House and in the Senate, which is why when we went through the legislation earlier in the year, it sailed through. We went through 3 committees on the House side, 3 committees on the Senate side. We didn't have a nay vote in any of the committees, referred out unanimously in all 6 committees. And then when it hit the House floor and the Senate floor, it also passed unanimously. The legislation does a lot of things, some technical, some substantive, some financial, some just administrative. We don't have time to cover all of them in this session, so we're not going to do that. We're just going to focus on the 3 bullet items that I have here up on the screen, which is extending the contaminated site eligibility cutoff date for local governments, streamlining the process that requires certain sites to obtain EPA approval to participate in the Brownfields program, mainly Superfund sites, and allowing larger brownfield properties to be subdivided into smaller parcels or I don't want to use the word parcel, I've been advised not to do that, into portioned sites. That's the real showstopper, and most of what our co-panelists will be discussing. There were some definitional changes that were made in the margins, a little nuanced, the most important of which is this new definition of a brownfield site. Historically, brownfield sites were defined as brownfields generically, but in the for practitioners, we all understood brownfield sites to be those brownfields, generic brownfields, which had actually entered into a brownfield site rehabilitation agreement. Now that's codified in statute, and it helps to activate and enable the showstopper legislation, which provides for an early NFA for portioned sites that are smaller than the larger contaminated area. The first piece of legislation that I have on the screen here is codified at 376.831. It's actually 3A through 3D, but I have on this first slide just 3A and 3B to make it fit. This is mainly all legislative intent language. We're going to go through this very quickly so we can get to our panelists. I just want to set up some context. And then the operative language really of the portion site NFA language is at 376.81 paren 3 paren C, which provided that you meet the applicable criteria, DEP is required and the local programs are required to issue an SRCO for these smaller subparcels. And this is a game changer for a lot of reasons. There are transactional implications, financial implications, and of course regulatory implications. Under the previous law, if you were representing a client or you as a principal had a site that was a smaller piece of a larger parcel, like a golf course, like an ag site, like a landfill and you did everything that you needed to do to get to closure, you had to sit on your hands until these other parties caught up to you, which makes things very difficult for lenders to understand and for buyers to understand. And it gets really, really complicated from a conditional closure perspective if you are required to transact your subparcel, which may be a planned community. You may take your smaller piece of the larger site and sell 60 or 70 home lots as an example, but you have to wait until the entire site is has achieved the NFA status to begin recording your DRCs. If you don't have control of your title anymore, it makes that process very, very difficult. Downstream buyers and lenders, and downstream buyers and lenders from downstream buyers and lenders, unless you've transacted the deal perfectly, it gets complicated and creates a lot of opportunity for mischief, grief, and malpractice. And I know that Howard and Kerri are going to speak to that from a practitioner's perspective. And then we're certainly interested in hearing how DEP is helping to work with impacted properties to realize the full benefit of that legislative change. The next major piece of the legislation is moving the eligibility cutoff date forward for local governments. Under the historic legislation, any party that caused or contributed to contamination after July 1, 1997 was forever prohibited from participating in the Brownfields program. No BSRA, no liability protection, no tax credits. We rolled that cutoff date forward for local governments. So if you are a local government or you represent local governments and they're sitting on landfills, public maintenance facilities, old golf courses, what have you, that couldn't, prior to July 1, 2025, get into the program because they did something after July 1, 1997 to cause or contribute to contamination, they can now come into the program. It's a showstopper for local governments. And then finally, we have, I believe, 90 or 92 Superfund sites in the state of Florida as just one example of federal program sites that have had historically a very difficult time getting into the Florida Brownfields program because the historic language prohibits inclusion unless EPA agrees to enter into an agreement with our good friends at FDEP foregoing their enforcement authority, which we all know is never going to happen. We worked very closely with DEP and with the local programs and with US EPA to tweak that language. And so instead of agreeing to forego their enforcement authority, we changed the paradigm completely. We flipped the script. All that is needed now for a Superfund site or other site subject to federal enforcement authority, like under RCRA or the Clean Water Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act, is essentially a stand-down letter from EPA. We don't object. We think it's a great thing for you guys to get into the Brownfields program, at which point DEP is authorized, if they deem it appropriate, to allow that site into the Brownfields program. There are a number of Superfund sites, at least from my experience, Howard, I know you've worked on a few, that will benefit from this legislative change, and it's a wonderful thing. More on the expanded eligibility for the federal brownfield programs, for the federal program sites, and that's the end of setting the stage here for the experts to talk about what they're seeing on the ground in the early stage of legislative implementation. And I'm going to begin with Ms. Kerri Barsh.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And I guess I want to share with you something that I'm seeing that I think is kind of interesting and maybe not, maybe it was not something directly contemplated when the statute was going around, but I have, and Michael Spivak's here with Langen, so he worked with me on these sites. We had 2 sites that were former solid waste facilities, and that they were in the program, and they had BSRAs. They were large sites, and we had financing on them, and we had the desire by the owner to ultimately at some point monetize these sites. And they were in Miami-Dade County. And they were taking some time because of the current, the prior requirement regarding the lesser sites not being able to go through and get a closure because of the fact that there were other properties that we would have to actually assess and wait for them. So the client considered that, and due to their own time constraints, and due to the fact, one thing we did in the financing, we made it such that we could wouldn't be in violation, we had to get an NFA determination. And in the financing documentation, we made it either an SRCO or a conditional SRCO, or we made it an NFA under Chapter 24 because Miami-Dade County allows you, through their own requirements, to get a closure. So at one point, the client said, let's get the closure because we need to with our financing and what we want to do with this later. And so regrettably, we terminated our BSRA. We did get some of the tax credits, but of course, we never got our bonus or anything. Lo and behold, this section passes, and Michael and I go to the client right afterwards and we say, you want to try to get back into the program? And so what we are doing is we are going back and we are terminating or requesting rescission of our prior termination. And then we have also going to, because of all the relevant all the relevant key factors, like the perp buster and all those are the same, legal description's the same, then we have got it cleared through Scott Sweeney et al., that we're going to then go back and get our bonus and use our prior eligible expenses. And so we've got 2 sites. That's going to be quite a bit, right, Michael? But anyway, the idea is now, because of this legislation, it allows us to go back and get what we had otherwise kind of earned, but we weren't able to kind of get to the finish line. One thing, though, we have to do is we have to resubmit our SAR, because it has to be approved under DEP, under DEP's regs, as opposed to Chapter 24. But I think this is something that you should think about. Are there things now that you may have, decisions you made based on the prior law, and are there ways to monetize that or get some flexibility out of it by going back in and maybe re-entering? So that's kind of something I wanted to share with you, because I think it shows you how you can, and the lender's happy because now they get the lender liability protection and the like. In fact, they weren't happy when we got out and closed under Chapter 24. So I don't know if anybody else has a similar circumstance, but we've got 2 very large sites. So I thought that was something that you might want to think about, is think outside the box, look at things again in terms of ways you might be able to avail yourself of this law and ways that you maybe hadn't contemplated before.
Kerri, because we talked about this the other day, it's a absolutely fascinating concept, but as you know, a closure under Chapter 24 or a closure under Chapter 27 in Broward County has different documentation and approval, not just the SAR. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about going back and redoing the SAR, talking about going back and redoing the Remedial Action Plan, SMP. You may be talking about going back and redoing the restrictive covenants, because you're now doing a DEP, Brownfields restrictive covenant closure, as opposed to a Chapter 24. And possibly, if you've gotten approvals for alternative covers or the types of flexibility that Wilbur or whoever Wilbur's successor might be, or David Van Landingham have given you through their local processes, as to whether or not those are approvable by DEP. So it's a great concept, it's a great result, but there's a lot of moving pieces to that.
I agree there's some moving pieces. We did, like I mentioned, we did look at that, and so what we did is we had a list of everything that was approved in terms of all of the approvals that we obtained under the local approval, let's call
Before
it,
you walked away from it.
before we walked away. And we did that. We got a list of everything. We also walked and talked with the local Brownfield coordinator, and then also who happens to be, even though she's the local Brownfield coordinator, she knows what the requirements are under Chapter 24 or Chapter 27. So we did do an evaluation of what it would mean from a timing perspective as well, and all that. The covenants were not the main thing. They're largely, I mean, they're simpler if you guys have ever done a Chapter 24 covenant or that notification, but in essence, they kind of have the same key points. So the client wasn't so concerned about that. It was more about the reports that we had to redo and relook at and the timing of that, because that was one of the first things that they really got out of the program before. So obviously, everybody's gonna have to do that. When you look at this, you're gonna make sure you're comparing apples to apples. And we did do that. We got a list, so I encourage you to understand what it means and the like. In this case, we did have a meeting with DEP. We had a meeting with local Brownfield. Then we had a meeting internally. So we kind of went through all that. And the client determined at the end of the day that it was something they wanted to do.
As well as, by the way, making sure you still have signatory authority to execute the new DRC.
Well, also, that was one of the key things that DEP said. Thank you, you're great for giving me my thing. DEP indicated is they wanted to make sure that how would the BSRA change, if any? You know, did you have the same legal? Was it the same party? Would there be any additional joinders? Joinder probably is less important to them, but what were all the main parts of the BSRA, if any, would they change? And so we looked at that first to even understand if this was something that what it would involve. And then we also looked at, okay, procedurally, because one of the things about that was important to the department was in terms of we wanted to be able to get this credit, the bonus. And one of the things they wanted to do is say, okay, can we keep your BSRA number? So how do we keep your BSRA number? And that is because I'm going to rescind my prior termination. And then and so that was one of the ways that we talked about procedurally how we would, let's call it resuscitate the BSRA, and so that it would have the same number. That would make it easier for them to keep track of it. It's already in their database. So there were a lot of reasons for that. I don't know if Jennifer has anything she wants to share on that as well, but that was some of our thinking and some of the initial discussions.
I was just going to say, I think something that was important with keeping the BSRA number was because our understanding was that the BSRA was terminated in 2025. So it was this calendar year. And so you're coming
Right.
back under the BSRA this same calendar year.
Yeah.
So that made it a little bit more straightforward from our perspective.
What I would like to do is I'd like to go back out to the 40,000-foot level before I get to you, Howard, and ask for your general perspective and insight on how this statute is playing itself out. But Kerri, you said something which is really important from a understanding the significant impact of this legislation, and it's important for everyone to hear that and to recognize it. You used the phrase crossing the finish line. Mm-hmm. And that's what this statute does in, I think, its most important part. It allows projects that are stuck to cross the finish line. I describe this part of the legislation as an early off-ramp. Many of us, experienced practitioners and regulators sitting here in the hall, have experienced frustration with not being able to close out projects because we have to wait for people who are not apparent, who aren't at the table, or who are recalcitrant. Mm-hmm. And that causes all kinds of problems and dysfunction. You now have the ability, provided that you navigate the specific criteria in the statute from a technical perspective. So there's a real practice opportunity here for consultants that didn't exist before the legislation to help clients navigate that criteria to get to get out from under. And if you want to think of it in key elements, there are projects that are just being conceived and conceptualized, where you're at the starting line. You haven't moved forward. You know you're part of a larger site because you're an ag site, you're a landfill, you're a golf course, whatever. You're going to have other parties to deal with, maybe, but maybe not. So that's number one. The second element is where you're stuck midstream and you want to get out. Either you're part of a multi-party BISRA, or you're not part of a multi-party BISRA because there are unknown or recalcitrant parties who aren't participating or cooperating the way that you need them to. And then there's Kerri's client who has left the race entirely but wants back in. That's an opportunity that I didn't even think of when we were running this legislation last year. So that's fabulous. Howard, what are you seeing from your practice?
I'm seeing a couple of things. And let me start with the federal sites. And I'm seeing this not so much from a Florida experience, but currently from a South Carolina experience. And I've got a large project that I'm working on that is a South Carolina Superfund site that is transitioning out of the through the delisting process and going through the delisting process into the state Brownfields program piece by piece. And that's a long, torturous process of having to wait until a portion of a brownfield site is delisted before you can get it into, or before a portion of the Superfund site is delisted so you can get it into the brownfields process. And it's a lot of mechanical moving parts to portion and portion safety barriers and everything, and it's a lot of upfront work. And this bill takes care of a lot of that, however, as we're now finding moving through the delisted portions where the record of decision is out, that portion of the site is delisted, and operationally EPA is no longer in the game. It's not the worst thing in the world to have only a state regulatory process as opposed to moving forward having a concurrent federal regulatory process with their viewpoints on what is required for risk assessment, what is required for remedial activity, what is required for closure confirmation at the same time that you're going through that with state, with the state regulatory agency, and being able to split them, and we still have the opportunity to go do that, to do it sequentially, shouldn't be underestimated. So that's the first part. The second part that I'm seeing a lot of teeth gnashing on is the portion sites in two different ways. And I had a great conversation early in the process, right after the bill came out, with Tim, some members of the Office of Counsel. John, I can't remember whether you were on the call or not. I think you might have been.
Howard, Tim who, for those who may not know?
I'm sorry, Tim Barr from FDEP. If you look at it now, if you are a brownfield site that is a portion of a larger facility, you can get an NFAC if you otherwise meet the closure criteria. But depending on the site, and most of the sites I'm involved in, you're not meeting the closure criteria on that common boundary with the remainder of the quote-unquote facility because it's not remediated yet, because if it was remediated, you wouldn't be worrying about this. The conversation becomes, how do you determine you meet the closure criteria if one or more boundaries of your site are still not clear or still not clean and may have soil contamination extending beyond the boundary or groundwater contamination extending beyond the boundary. And the answer was, and it was a great answer, you need to look as to whether or not you are not a generator, but the generator. And that's a great answer, but there's no process for making that determination on how you do that. So I'd suggest, and what I'm hearing from a lot of people, is either a guidance document that gives you that short form of how you determine in this situation that you meet the closure criteria, or a glitch bill in a subsequent year that just says you ignore that boundary under certain circumstances. So that's issue one. Issue two, which is entirely retrospective in nature, and Michael hit very cleanly on the practice tip for both consultants and lawyers. Now you've got a clear path if you are a brownfield that is part of a larger facility on how you set up your brownfield. One of the things that we didn't discuss is if your brownfield site is a multi-parcel development site where you may have 3 or 4 different end users. You may have a gas station and a grocery store and a warehouse or something else that in all likelihood may be developed and may be remediated by different parties. Your practice tip is you need to look at that now with your client before you move forward and set them up as different BISRAs. Because remember, this is a BISRA that is part of a larger facility that may have not been remediated. That leaves us with, and Michael, I'm sorry I forgot the number, how many active brownfields do we have in the state right now?
Brownfield
Sites? Lots?
Yeah, 500 plus.
500 plus. Retrospectively, for all of those sites that are a single BISRA with multiple users, and we've all looked at them and worked on them, there has to be some mechanism to let those pieces get through and get to a clear and clean closure without making them retroactively go back and split one BISRA into 4 BISRAs, because that's paperwork you don't need and we certainly don't need. But there's got to be a set of criteria that allows the department to say, okay, you have met your closure obligations, similar to the criteria that they use for a status letter right now. You have met your obligations for closure on your piece of your site. We're not going to make you wait, or we're not going to look to you for more remediation. And that's the other thing that's out there. Can we figure out how to, and I don't think we can do it by guidance document, we might be able to do it by rule or by glitch bill, but give some relief to those existing sites that are multi-user single BISRA sites. That's what I'm seeing.
So it's wonderful that we have the authority here to speak to that, but before you do, let me say this, because the statute's very clear, and I remember discussing this particular point with Tim when we coordinated with DEP on the draft legislation. The legislation is agnostic as to whether a BISRA is required to let out individual end users at an otherwise multi-parcel, multi-party BISRA. The language of this, what the language of the statute says is that if you have a discrete release, then you can get, and you demonstrate you meet the NFA criteria in 62.780.680. You meet the NFA criteria, whether it's conditional or unconditional, meaning that you control your property boundaries however you can do that, then you're entitled to closure. But there's nothing in the statute that says that the department must or is only allowed to require those sub-parties to enter into or execute their own BISRA. Doesn't have to happen, so I'm interested in understanding the policy. The statute is absolutely agnostic, but the other point I'll make, Howard, and then we'll hear from Jennifer, is this, that the ability to access that early off-ramp and get your closure is not based on end user, but on discharge, on sufficiently within the four corners of the criteria, identifying a site, right? The discharge that occurred and the extent of the discharge in all media. Jennifer?
Okay, so there's a lot there going on. So
We didn't want to leave you a small piece.
okay, so I think the multi-party BISRA issue is going to be something that we're going to have to tackle. I reached out to Scott on my way down here, and I said, you know, approximately how many of those are we working on? And he said somewhere probably between 15 and 20. So yes, there's about maybe 20 active multi-party BISRAs out there that could be problematic. Let me first say that I do think the changes are going to be very impactful, and they are going to allow for a lot of smaller brownfield sites, portions of larger contaminated sites, move forward. And this is going to help hopefully spur on redevelopment, get to site closure quicker, and hopefully allow for folks to participate in the VICTIC program. So a lot of positive outcomes for the changes. But you know, there's going to be some challenges as well. And I think the biggest challenge probably is going to be determining whether or not the portion of the larger contaminated site has fully addressed the contamination on that site and adequately addressed anything emanating from that property. So that's under 62-780. That's what the language says. That's what we're going to be looking for. So I think, you know, it's going to be a technical discussion, and I would encourage everyone to work with your DEP partners early and often on those decisions. But yeah, I think there's a couple things on the Superfund sites. It would be great if we could have a Superfund site that is a fund lead site, and an interested party come and say, we want the site to be in the Brownfields program to EPA. That means that the state does not have to hopefully pay the O&M costs and the long-term monitoring costs. So we would absolutely welcome that opportunity. That's a win-win. The local government, the date change, I think we're going to see a lot of new BISRAs from local governments coming in because now, you know, if they can apply. And I forgot what was some of the questions. So those are some of the high points. I do think the Superfund site issue is going to be challenging, as you said. There's a lot to Superfund remedial action, and I think for sites where there's a responsible party lead, if those are the types of Superfund sites that folks are interested in, that's going to be complicated, and I'll be interested to see how EPA works with you all on those. But we would absolutely look forward to partnering with an interested party on a site that's got long-term obligations or O&M. So,
Jennifer, quick question for you regarding the Superfund sites or other federal program sites that go into the Brownfields program or want to go into the Brownfields program under this new legislation. Is there going to be a separate ombudsperson within DEP to handle that federal aspect, or would we still go through the DEP district coordinators or through Scott Sweeney at the Tallahassee level?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I would encourage working with Scott and also Mubin Darji, who's here today. She is over our waste site cleanup section, and they oversee all the cleanups of Superfund sites in the state. So Yeah, because there's two different tracks, right? You know, whether or not it's going to be brownfields, but also whether or not EPA is going to give us a letter of no objection, and then we'll follow up with a letter of concurrence. So once that letter from EPA of no objection is received, on the Superfund side of it, we're going to have to be involved and know, okay, what does this mean for our Superfund program? So yeah, I would say work through your brownfields coordinator, but as it moves along, to definitely involve Tallahassee and our waste site cleanup section.
Very good. And I would like to say this about DEP. They were magnificent partners every step of the way, as were the local pollution control programs, moving the legislation forward. There was, I believe, 100% buy-in almost from day one. We had a lot of complicated technical issues to work through, including the issue that Jennifer brought up and that I telegraphed earlier about the possibility of contamination at a portion parcel migrating off-site, and making sure that the legislation wasn't considered a get-out-of-jail-free card for those types of issues, which again, why it creates so much more opportunity for consultants to help clients and other agents and principals work through that type of issue.
I have a question. So I'm familiar with this site that was, it was never really a BizRes site, but it's based on the same concepts about, it uses, and it was like a settlement agreement that uses some of that terminology, but wasn't actually a BizRes site. And they're not allowed to get their closure until both different independent sites are in fact receive a determination. Yes, I was just wondering, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I will. Are you, any thoughts about with that concept you have the statute, with the department looking at that perhaps a little bit differently, because now you have this precedent and allowing maybe one of the sites to go forward, get their closure? There's no funding involved, but just out of curiosity.
So did the entities cause or contribute to the contamination of the site? Is it?
Not the current.
So it otherwise would be eligible under the Brownfields
Correct.
program?
Mm-hmm.
Was it a site that's undergoing like CERCLA? Is it considered a Superfund alternative site or no?
I don't know the history if it was at that point.
Okay.
I just know that it's taken a long time. And I was just curious, have you guys considered it? I'm trying to think of ways that we can use the statute beyond just that, and just thought maybe that was
Right.
something.
Well,
Sounds
and
like-
not to give away part of tomorrow morning's conversation,
sorry.
but what an excellent topic to potentially bring up at the Contaminated Media Forum.
Which needs to be resurrected also.
Yes.
Let's open it up to the audience.
Oh, okay.
First, are there any questions from anyone in the audience? Laurel?
Let's bring you up, Mike, Laurel, because I'm old and I can't hear that well. No, I don't want you to yell, but they're bringing you a mic.
Okay, so, on the Superfund.
Laurel, hold on. Laurel, hold on.
And I speak softly, so a perfect storm, huh? So, on the Superfund sites, I'm just curious, like there's a fundamental sort of a policy disconnect because, okay, Brownfield is Rebecca and CERCLA is not. So how, and in a site that is not a fund lead site, how is this going to work? I mean, I don't understand how we're going to get to a closure under a BISRA that does not effectuate complete, for example, restoration of the groundwater, which is what's mandated under CERCLA.
Yeah.
How are you seeing that? What's the department thinking on that?
Well, we haven't seen it yet. I'll say I've got one Superfund site right now that's interested in obtaining a conditional SRCO, and it's in the process of being delisted. That would be the first Superfund site if we issue a conditional SRCO that meets both criteria. But you're absolutely right. EPA, really want groundwater to get to unrestricted use, unrestricted exposure, which usually means getting to the MCL. And as you all know, on our properties, we can close with conditions. And there's no additional groundwater monitoring needed. So potentially, if a brownfield site, was to take on a Superfund site, or vice versa, they would have to continue likely monitoring that site until the GCTLs were met, even though under our state regs, they could close with conditions. Yeah, and frankly, that's what the state is doing right now. I mean, when we take over the O&M on a Superfund site, we have to continue doing the groundwater monitoring until that site meets the criteria. So it would be the same for a responsible party or interested party, I should say.
But of course, the benefit would be they'd be able to get tax credits.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
And the liability
And
protection.
liability, yeah.
And
Yes.
yeah. And
Yes.
all of that.
And Laurel, frankly, that's how this concept was birthed. There are folks out there, and we represent a couple of them, who have taken the position, we will comply with the federal criteria and the state criteria on top of the federal criteria because we want to be in the Brownfields program. We want the tax credits. We're going to be spending the money anyway. And we need the liability protection, not just for us, but for our lenders. So it's existential.
It just becomes very confusing when there's two completely different remedial end goals and processes to get there at the same time, which is why on the South Carolina site, we waited till they delisted, and they delisted for an industrial end use, and we'll now be changing that in the state process to some non-industrial sites.
This is a good conversation to have because I think with respect to this issue, expanded eligibility for federal program sites, we've solved as much as we can to get these sites into the program because the previous legislation, which was otherwise immovable, simply didn't work. EPA was never going to forego its enforcement authority ever. So we said, fine, we'll take that enforcement authority, we'll see you one, we'll raise you one, add 62,780, but give us the bennies. Give us the tax credits and the liability protection.
So one other, to throw the first role in the food fight on this issue, to me, it's a potential point of entry for getting an ARAR waiver on the basis that the state is not enforcing, whatever the number is because we have risk-based corrective action. That is a concept that historically EPA has not contemplated, but I think under this administration, it makes perfect sense. Because we all know Rebecca is the way to go, right? That is the way to go. It's the only thing that's cost effective and makes sense. Congress doesn't have, they can't do anything. So they're never going to amend the statute. But there is already the ability to
start meeting again to do anything.
Right. But there's already the ability to seek an ARAR waiver under that kind of circumstance. So I really want to explore that.
Good luck. No, yeah, I mean, in Florida, I don't think we have a Superfund site where we've got an ARAR waiver, like technical or otherwise. So I think other states, Region 4, have done it, but not Florida. So, yes. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, that's right. There are no sacred
Right.
cows in brownfields.
Right.
We are fortunate to have Allison Amram here with us. Allison is the Brownfields coordinator for Hillsborough County. And Allison, if you would speak to how EPC is implementing the new legislation.
So I'm pretty sure you're talking about the Pitch Pine closure. So this was a site that Laurel was representing, the perf buster, and it was an old wood treatment facility operational up until like the 60s, and it operated on multiple parcels of property, and it was smaller than the Brownfield site. The Brownfield site had a redevelopment plan, but the other properties were owned by other people doing other things, other operations. So we had multiple discussions with DEP. EPC is a delegated program, so we are part of Florida's Brownfield program. We're just like an independent, we're like the district Brownfield coordinators, but we work on the county level. So we coordinate with them to make sure that we're all consistent with the decisions in the program. So we had multiple discussions on how are we going to get this site closed, and the technical decisions were that because the property had extensive contamination at the edges, EPA had come in the 80s and done soil removal, but because there was such a large amount of contamination, arsenic in the soils and groundwater, that they wanted everything that was contiguous. If it was contaminated at the property boundary, go until it's not. Okay, the definition of a contaminated site, all that needed to be cleaned up. So that was really difficult. The project kind of stalled periodically, and then there was some interest in selling the property, and things picked up. So the property owner assessed off-site. He remediated everything, and they got as far as institutional controls on everything except one property. And that property owner wouldn't respond. They were a large corporation, they couldn't find people to respond to them. So when the rule passed, I think it might have been July 7th or 8th, that Laurel and the property owner said, hey, we want to close. We can close. July 1st was the new Brownfields bill, and the same act that contaminated my property was happening on other parcels. So, so we talked with DEP, and everybody said, yeah, there were other activities that were happening off your property. So we worked together to lay out the controls, and we let them close without the off-site property. In the meantime, the off-site property got some legal representation and decided that this was bad news for them, because now we have all this information saying you've got contamination on your property. The perf bus, or the Brownfield site owner, actually controlled their contamination, but now there's no institutional control, so they'd be on the hook for that. And they came back in during the petition period of the closure order and managed to get a DRC for their property controls, and we issued an amended closure order actually it was the 21st day, the last day of the petition period, so that everything was controlled. So everything got controlled, and it probably helped force the off-site party to come in and work the controls. But it was all done in conjunction with the department and lots of discussions, and it was ugly, but it got the job done twice.
Allison, thank you. Edwin, I want to put you on the spot. We have Edwin Baez here from Beasley. He's an underwriter, and he's helping a lot of us out on our projects to transact, especially risky sites. Edwin, I'm wondering what your thinking is with respect to this aspect of the new legislation, the one that allows for the early off-ramp for portion sites. Is that language something that would go into your underwriting and make it more likely for Beasley to issue favorable policies at favorable quotes, or is it a push?
We're pretty accustomed to having these situations already with parcels that are larger. You have one major area that maybe that contamination is flowing underneath other portions of the parcels, and those parcels are going to be sold off. So at the end of the day, it really depends on the characteristics of the site, but that's common for us. And at the end of the day, the thought process, what I've seen majority, is you have an umbrella, and that umbrella kind of covers all the parties up to a certain limit. So our policies we could do up to 25 mil, 10 years. So it's kind of that thought process that everyone's covered under this umbrella. And if that's enough, then that can help transition the risk.
And what about the expanded eligibility for federal program sites? Would it make it more likely, or again, is it just a push to underwrite on favorable terms a Superfund site that is being redeveloped under the Florida Brownfields program?
We don't really look at it that that's not that big of a difference for us. At the end of the day, like we do brownfield sites, we do non-brownfield sites. It's a matter of the conditions and and risk transfer. How close are they to closure? Will they be able to get closure? From whom? So we're used to looking at the full gambit.
Very good. Questions? Robin?
I guess this is for the whole panel. So on a site where you have off-site, arguably you have off-site contamination that may have contaminants, similar arsenic, benzoate-pyrene, and that there's other potential off-site sources. So how is that going to be viewed by DEP? And how do you complete, adequately complete your assessment and complete your controls for off-site? Say, CSX. You have a rail line that is common, on a common boundary. Arguably there's not been a release or discharge from your smaller parcel onto the CSX parcel, but they have similar contaminants.
Robin, that's a great question. You read my mind. I want to quote from the statute. I brought it up in anticipation of that kind of question. Then we want to hear from Jennifer, Howard, and Kerri, and then from the other experts, technical experts in the audience. If you look at 376.81, paren 3, paren C, 2, sub 2, what the language says is that DEP may not refuse to issue an SRCO for the brownfield site, regardless of whether it has engineering or institutional controls. Fine. Here's the operative language. This subparagraph applies even where similar contamination exists elsewhere on the contaminated site, which was the result of similar or related activities or operations that occurred both on the contaminated site and the brownfield site, provided that all soil and groundwater contamination emanating from the brownfield site is adequately addressed pursuant to 62780. So Robin, I think you're asking, what does adequately addressed mean?
Address pursuant to chapter 6280?
Exactly.
entail?
That's right.
Yeah.
So Jennifer, you're now on the hot seat. How is FDEP looking at that?
So I'll just say right off the bat, I think, so you go through 62780 and you do your assessment. If you have groundwater contamination, that is going to complicate this, right? If it's just a soil issue and your soil contamination, you can show that soil contamination is similar to the other parcels, ag lands, golf course, that's going to be a little bit easier then for you to demonstrate that your property isn't the source that's emanating, onto the other properties. But groundwater it's going to be hard. You're going to have to show that the contamination from that brownfield site is adequately addressed. So are we going to ask for an off-site sample? Probably, yes. You're going to have to work with your technical practitioners and go through the assessment. And like I said, I think if you can make the argument that it's widespread and that your parcel is part of a larger contaminated site and it's limited to soil, that's probably going to be a much easier argument to make that your brownfield site is just the parcel and not chase it off-site.
So Robin, this was part of, I think, the original comments we made. The department has told us that they're looking for evidence that you are not a generator, the generator.
Right.
And the problem is, if you take a look at guidance or rule on how you determine something to be historical background or naturally occurring background or anthropogenic background or regional or sub-regional, it's not helpful in its existing state to a quick resolution.
Right.
Which is why I'm suggesting the department put guidance out on exactly what it wants to see. Do you look at, and with all due respect, I disagree a little bit. I don't think groundwater is that hard. You just need to show groundwater on your site is not attenuating, but still an exceedance over the property boundary. It needs to be in equilibrium, it needs to be disattenuating, it needs to be something like that, showing that you're not the generator, Laurel. I see the question coming up. But we need some guidance document that gives you the steps, because if you recall, historically, if you look at the existing guidance documents on how you look at something regional, sub-regional, you can be testing for 4 quarters, you're going, or more, to determine that. And if we're looking at a statutory change that gives you a quick off-ramp, I don't want to blow a tire the minute I'm getting on the off-ramp and be stuck there for 4, 6, 8 quarters trying to establish it.
But the thing is, we're empowered to have the conversation, right? It puts us on first base, subject to conversations among the college here about how to improve the language, whether it's a glitch bill, whether it's a guidance document, whether it's through the contaminated media.
Whether it's something that can be done in the contaminated media forum.
Right.
Right.
Kerri?
You know,
I was just going to say that also go ahead.
Yeah, so in our situation, Alice and my situation, the client had actually delineated all of the groundwater issue, and we had proposed and had an NRIC proposed for that area. So the other alternative, if your situation works, okay, that would adequately address it. Then I'm not having to argue, did it start on my little postage Brownfield site, or,
Right.
but that worked. And ultimately, our issue was that the adjacent landowner wouldn't agree to the DRC, which was needed because of soil conditions. And having the leverage, frankly, of 733, they said, oh boy, we better get on this train or we get nothing. So,
And Laurel, that would be an NRIC for the remainder of the contaminated site.
that was for the entire, we delineated the entire groundwater issue. We had already demonstrated it was stable.
Works for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's the other way to get
Elegant.
that off ramp.
Right.
Jennifer, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I think
No.
I was just agreeing with Laurel.
Okay.
Sorry.
So this is a remediation conference, and I'm interested in hearing also from the consultants who are in the trenches, literally, on these technical issues. And
Yeah.
is there anyone out there, or multiple folks out there, who have been looking at this language and thinking about how to thread the needle here, thread the technical needle to make the technical showing that needs to be made regarding how to adequately address, pursuant to 62-780, the demonstration that the contamination emanating from the Brownfield site, we have our arms around it? Anyone?
I just want to
Bueller?
point, I think there's 2 parts of that. It has to be emanating from, and the
Yes.
second part is adequately addressed.
Yes.
And I think it has to, so I think if you can show that it's not emanating, meaning it's
You don't
stable
need to
or
worry about
whatever,
the adequate
you don't need to, I would argue you don't need to worry
Well,
about
then
the
it would be
adequate
adequately addressed on its own terms.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
Right? It would be the same as making up a
Correct.
62-780.680 paren 1 showing that you're entitled to NFA closure, not NFAC closure.
Agreed. So I think you can't read out, you have to look at it both ways. That's the first thing, is the emanating from,
You guys
and then
can
it goes
find
to the
out.
next one.
Hold on, Robin. Michael Spivak, I'm interested in your thoughts, too.
I had to think this through for a second, because it's totally going to depend on the site, the groundwater flow, the compound of concern. You're looking at a landfill and you're looking at iron, how are you going to prove it's emanating from the landfill and not just background? But if you're looking at VOCs, that's a little bit different. So I don't know if there's one answer here. You go down in South Florida, parts of Central Broward, groundwater flow is pretty stagnant. Figuring out groundwater flow and in which way it's emanating, that could change by the day, depending on the rainfall.
Michael, do you think that there are land use types and historic activities that would make it more easier to prove up that demonstration than others, in your experience?
Agricultural areas, if something emanating from a former agricultural field to something that was not agricultural in the past. Landfills, assuming you're not talking about iron, that's pretty cut and dry. Gas stations, that's clearly a point source. But it's more of these, when you get into areas like, let's say, half of Broward, central Broward County, Oakland Park, it was all agricultural. How are you going to tell the difference? You got miles and miles of agricultural fields. That's going to be a tough site to prove where the point source is. And, you know, you have these non-homogeneous impacts. You know, it's going to be very subjective.
So if you can't, I'll throw this out there for the group, if you can't point to a point source, do you then not need to make the demonstration?
I would argue, yeah.
What if it's an exceeding
So Kerri says yes.
and attenuating towards the boundary, not clean at the boundary? You're not pointing to a point source, but you're clearly perceived as a generator.
I don't know that follows. I'm not a PG or a PE. Does anyone agree with that point or disagree? That if
And I didn't even factor to say that.
I agree with Kerri. I think that if you have, you know, a regional ag group of properties, you should not have to get to that threshold point of emanating from. You should be able to show, you know, dieldrin or arsenic, you know, is regionally elevated and only delineate the four corners of your property and demonstrate that the contamination on your property is adequately addressed. That's what I think Kerri was saying.
Yeah.
Allison has a comment. She right up there.
Thanks. So I think it really is a technical question, and a lot of it's going to depend on what is your groundwater upgradient. You know, what are your background concentrations? What are your flow conditions? What are your contamination gradients? Do you have a landfill that has really high iron, but you see it decreasing? You know,
That's your point.
I would say that you're, you know, if you're above your background level, your landfill has impacted the iron until you're below your background concentrations. So that is usually something you can figure out. We've had cases where the pitch pine ran into some railroad spurs, and the groundwater arsenic concentrations increased. And so we worked with the department to say, that's not yours, that's the railroad added influence. So you've got to look at multiple things. You've got to look at your groundwater chemistry, and maybe it's a lot more than just looking at your contaminant of concern. What other things have been impacted by your site? Right, you know, so there are a lot of things, and Brian Dougherty was really a big fan of multiple layers of evidence. You know, look at this every way you can and see what makes sense, you know? So, that's my input. Thanks.
Anything else? Questions in the back?
Michael, I got
Sure, Paco.
engineer, not a lawyer, so pardon my ignorance. Number 2, refuse to issue a site rehab for a brownfield site regardless of whether it has an engineering or institutional control. So if I have a portion of a bigger site, let's say it's, you know, got methyl ethyl death all over, and I got a little gas station area here, and we've met 62780 criteria here for closure with conditions. Does this mean that they don't have to get the NFA and the closure with conditions? We don't need to have the institutional or engineering control? Regardless of whether it has engineering or does that mean that it's for either with controls or totally clean closure? Is that what that means?
Thoughts from the panel?
Right, a portion of it, right. But if that portion is going to get an NFAC or conditional closure and the VICTIC bonus, can it get that before it has the necessary engineering?
I think that's talking about controls on the remainder of the site, not your portion that's remediated.
That's right.
Say that again?
Right.
I think that's talking about the no necessity to have controls on the remainder of the contaminated site outside of your brownfield site.
That's exactly right.
I don't know if that clarifies it or makes it more confusing, but that language talks about the remainder of the contaminated, I won't use the word site, facility.
Yeah.
That's not remediated
So the big,
yet. Right.
the Brownfield site is the whole pizza, and my little gas station is a slice.
No.
No.
It's the
Brownfield
opposite.
other
site's
way
a
around.
tiny little piece of a bigger contaminated site, unless you're creative like Laurel and you get an NRIC on the rest of it, in which case it does have an institutional control.
Okay.
But you don't need one.
Right.
All
Th-
right,
Think of it this way, Paco. You have a golf course,
yeah,
right? You have a golf course, and just 1/3 of the golf course is being cleaned up and redeveloped under a BISRA.
okay.
2/3 is outside of the Brownfields program. No one is doing anything with respect to the other 2/3. You have addressed under this language all of the 62,780 criteria for your third that is now the Brownfield site.
Okay,
Whoever owns the balance of the property hasn't done anything. They've got exceedances in groundwater.
okay.
They've got
And
exceedances
they'll
in
get to it
soil.
when they get to it.
They'll get to it when they get to it.
And we won't be spending our lives convincing lenders that a status letter is just as good as an NFAC.
That's right. You get your off-ramp. You get to go home.
Okay, so let's say that my third, which is the Brownfield site,
Yes.
normally would need an institutional or engineering control.
Which it still might.
It's still,
Yeah.
what
It
is
still
that
might.
You still have to
regardless
have it.
of-
That refers to the rest
Oh,
Of the contaminated site.
Right.
So
Okay.
my three holes may get an institutional control, either recorded one or a non-recorded one, but it's not required that the remaining, I gotta do math now. 15 holes, thank you. Math, not my strong suit. The remaining 15 holes needs an institutional control on it, although Laurel's given us a path for the controlled part of the equation of putting a control on it, if you want to get there that way.
That's a whole other lecture.
okay, thanks.
Anything else for the good of the order from our panelists? No? Well, there is a lot to think about, and what I take away most from this conversation is the identification of some of these early practice points that need to be closely monitored and taken into account when conceptualizing your brownfield project on the front end. How do you access that off-ramp if you have a portion parcel that is surrounded by issues and exceedances that aren't going to be addressed anytime soon? It's going to require collaboration between consultants and lawyers and regulators. And the other point I'll make is this, as Howard mentioned a few times, tomorrow we're going to be talking about the Contaminated Media Forum, resurrecting the Contaminated Media Forum as a vehicle to further advance the tools that we have, administrative and statutory, to get to closure sooner on some of these complicated sites. We will see you next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Great audience.
We got a reception outside at the pool. The food will be out in about another 15 minutes, but I think the bars are open, so go get a drink. Thank you.